Hi, I'm Adrian Randolph, Dean of Northwestern's Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences, and welcome to today's virtual conversation with Weinberg College. This is a series designed to deliver updates on cutting-edge research from our very own faculty experts, and I'm really grateful to have you with us here today. And I hope that as individuals, you feel very connected to our community, the community you've invested in so deeply, so thank you. I've just really enjoyed all of our conversations. Some of you, I'm hoping, have caught some of the other ones, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation with Professor Al Tillery. But first, a few practical matters. If you have any technical difficulties during the talk, please use the chat function. It's at the bottom of my screen. I'm assuming it's the bottom of your Zoom window. We have folks on the other end of that chat to try and help you. Second, we'll be taking questions throughout the session. So if anything comes into your mind, please feel free to submit this using the Q&A function, which should be next to, also at the bottom of your screen. And my goal is to get to as many of those questions as possible. Finally, this conversation and all our past sessions are available on YouTube. We'll circulate the links to each of these after this. So now let me turn my attention to our wonderful topic today and visitor, Alvin B. Tillery Jr. And he's an associate professor in Weinberg College's Department of Political Science and the founder and director of the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy. His research in American politics focuses on presidential leadership, racial and ethnic politics, and social movements. His book, Between Homeland and Motherland, Africa, US Foreign Policy, and Black Leadership in America, won the W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. His papers have appeared in American Political Science Review, Studies in American Political Development, and the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics. And in this recent election cycle, Al could be seen on many news outlets across the country. I did a listing of them, but I see it's not in my notes here. So Al, you'll have to tell us which other ones. It was MSNBC and some others. But thank you, Al, for joining us today. It really is great to see you.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for inviting me to be in conversation with you and our wonderful supporters.
So I wanted to kick off the discussion with a question really focusing on the center you direct. It's the Center for Democracy and Diversity, the study of democracy and diversity. I can't remember exactly when it was founded, but certainly within the last few years. Can you tell us a little bit about the mission of the center? What lies at the heart of it? What motivates the CSDD?
Yeah, well, we started out in 2017, thanks to your generous grant that you provided me to start the center. And you know, honestly, the center was rooted in my deep concerns about where we were headed as a democracy. And, you know, I don't want to sound self-serving to make myself seem prescient on a day when we are impeaching the former president of the United States for the second time for fomenting insurrection. But just to put a fine point on it, I'm of the generation of Black Americans that, you know, was born, you know, at the end of our racial dictatorship in this country or shortly thereafter. So I was born in 1971, 3 years after the Federal Housing Act of '68 put a formal end to Jim Crow in our country. And so there's a lot of hardships that came with growing up in that period in this country and integrating spaces. You know, I've said repeatedly that I'm a lynching survivor from the time that I was 8 years old. Some older kids at my bus stop tried to kill me because I integrated it. And, you know, for many decades, I think that I operated under the assumption that things were getting better in America and that my children wouldn't have to face any of the difficulties that, you know, I faced growing up. And I think I put a lot of energy into my research trying to demonstrate that point. And then we hit 2016 and the rhetoric changed dramatically and the politics changed dramatically. And it began to look a lot like the counter-Reconstruction period in America to me. And I was alarmed. And so I went to you and I think some of our other, core supporters and had conversations about my desire to make Northwestern a place where people can learn how to live well together in a multiracial democracy that's also gender equitable and LGBTQ plus friendly, and disseminate research and information about how to do that to the real world, to be a real translational center. And so that's what we're about, and we're 4 years into it, and I think we're having some good success.
Yeah, I mean, it's been phenomenal, the success, and I think that's partly registered in the list of the news outlets you have been involved with: NBC, MSNBC, CBS, and WGBN and GN, excuse me. And this really has helped, I think, advertise not just the center, but also Northwestern in terms of we being at the forefront of research-based political theory and practice. So thank you for all of the work you've done in publicizing the great work done in Northwestern. Now that we know a little bit about the mission, or at least the sort of originating context for why this is so important, and I think maybe later on we can reflect on the history of these words, diversity and democracy, through the experiment that is the United States. It still is sort of this grand experiment in democracy in the last 200 years, and it's undergoing some difficulties.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about sort of how diversity has been hardwired into the various ups and downs of the word democracy in the wake of the Constitution, basically. But now that we know a little bit about the mission, you can return to that. Could you share a little bit about your particular research? I mean, the things that fired you up in getting involved in this project, which is a bit broader than your research, but what aspects of your research led to this? And I think maybe you could say a bit about BLM, right? Black Lives Matter,
Yeah.
which really has a transformative effect.
Yeah, so my research is on leadership and social movements, and at the level of the presidency. What I'm interested in is building inclusive leaders or understanding inclusive leaders. And so, my first book was on how civil rights leaders in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s navigated their desire to have a positive impact on US foreign policy toward Africa, and how they worked with progressive presidents who wanted to assist with that project. Harry Truman, Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. And so, we have, from the period of the 50s and 60s, when our society finally began to shed our history as a racial dictatorship, we have models of inclusive leadership. And so what my research is about is kind of figuring out what are the common elements of inclusive leadership, and then how do they get things done? And so, I started researching the presidency through, a mentor of mine, Dick Neustadt, who wrote a really famous book called Presidential Power. And most presidents read it before they go into the Oval Office, because it gives these real, sort of highlights about how to actually do things as a leader. And so I became really interested in, well, what about this issue of leading on diversity? And so, that was one research angle that I pursued. And so I do a lot on presidential communication about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then the other piece of it is looking at social movement leaders, Miss Rosa, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dr. King. What were the hallmarks of their success? How did they communicate in such a way that they literally overturned with love the most stringent racial dictatorship in the Western Hemisphere? And so when Black Lives Matter rose up, I saw academia really scrambling to account for this new movement. Where does it fit? Is it like the civil rights movement of the 1950s or 60s? No, there are these key differences. They talk about, centering trans people, and, they talk, in a very intentional way about, feminism and women being at the head of the movement. That's different, right? And so what I wanted to do was to sort of research these differences and to see how they're landing on, Black communities in particular, but America at large. And then I wanted to see if they're being successful, and what kinds of things are they talking about? And so I think I published, 3 or 4 papers on Black Lives Matter since 2018. And, they've all made some points that I think have gotten some attention. The big point that really excites me is there's a lot of pushback against Black Lives Matter, people on the right saying, oh, it incites violence against the police. So I went out and tested that. I looked at all of their Twitter communication from 2014 to 2016, 20,000 tweets, and I found 0 tweets that encourage violence or even aggression toward police. On the contrary, the overwhelming, amount of tweets are about individual rights. Oh, it's so terrible that, Philando Castile's individual rights were violated. He didn't have due process, and then the rest are about getting people to vote, right? And so, the project of Black Lives Matter really started there for me. Recently, our brilliant colleague Tabitha Bonilla, who's in CESP, but also has a courtesy appointment in political science, she and I had a paper in the APSR where we looked at sort of how the feminist messaging and the identity messaging around BLM, how it affects mobilization. And we found some things that are pretty interesting. And then we recently found in a survey of voters in Georgia that white voters that voted for Warnock and Ossoff to be the Democratic senators in Georgia, flipping those seats from Republicans, were actually more motivated by BLM messaging than any other messages, right? And it makes sense. I mean, it's the suburbs that really, where these flips happened. COVID messaging doesn't really work in the suburbs because people in the suburbs are more affluent. They have more ability to distance. And so what we proved is that there's a real racial justice coalition among Black and white voters in Georgia. And that's something the Democrats should know and utilize instead of always running away from, these issues because they're worried they're going to lose the median white voter. Our research says that that's not happening. So it's really exciting.
One of the distinctive things about your research, and I should mention APSR, for those who don't know, our American Political Science Review. It's that's a pretty distinguished venue for research.
Keep trying for 20 years, you'll eventually get one.
I think one of the things that's distinctive about your research too is the way you leverage sort of quantitative or almost ethnographic research to your thinking theoretically about leadership, et cetera. And I think that has certainly led to some of the more public findings you've had about things. So I just think people should know that it's a distinctive form of research within your discipline. I wanted to just push you a little bit to say something more about Black Lives Matter. I think on the one hand, it seems a cohesive movement. On the other hand, it seems like a coalition. And I'm curious in terms of a taxonomy of movements, is it, you said it's distinctive from previous civil rights movements. Is there something about the way in which it is sort of morphing into being a unified element versus it being a coalition that makes it distinctive? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think that's a really great analysis. You should come and write a paper with us, right? I mean, so the caricature of the civil rights movement is that it was this movement where really one guy is at the center, Dr. King, right? And so he's the leader. He's sort of laying down these markers for the nation's progress, and people are responding to him. I mean, that's really not what happened, right? There were 6 main civil rights organizations in coalition. We call them the Big 6 organizations. And Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, did garner a lot of attention because the media made Dr. King the face of the movement. He was a singularly talented individual in terms of communicating the message of nonviolence and how that would translate into democratic renewal in America. The revisionist history that we have on the movement that BLM has embraced is that it was a movement that silenced women and squelched dissent and top down. I think that a lot of those critiques are really overstated, right? So when BLM comes on the scene in 2014-15, they're really trying to do something intentionally different. They want to look much more like the Occupy Wall Street movement or the environmental movement in a place like Germany or France, right? Which is
deeply decentralized, no leaders emerging, claiming of the mantle. But what we saw very quickly is that the media made leaders, right? Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, Patrisse Cullors, the media attention that they garnered in the first wave of Black Lives Matter coverage looks very much like what happened to Dr. King. So they can say that they're not the leaders in the way that Dr. King would have said in 1958, but the media says that they are, right? And so Black Lives Matter has had trouble negotiating this role until 2020. 2020, what we saw is that Black Lives Matter really has matured in some impressive ways. Whereas they used to eschew electoral politics, they are now driving electoral politics through a pact, by partnering with traditional organizations. And that's the change that we saw happening with the electoral flip in Georgia. I don't think that we'll ever have a centralized movement. I don't think that we need one, but I do think that it's very clear that there's some learning, some social learning happening on the part of the leaders, and that they're becoming more engaged in negotiating with power. They've elected a congresswoman, Cori Bush, in St. Louis, is straight out of the Ferguson uprisings, right? And so those are things that actually excite me because it shows that there's a chance for, as you put it, this coalition to grow and have a real influence on our politics.
That leads really directly to my next question, because so much about Black Lives Matter has become a multifaceted political project, but it also emerges directly from some issues to do with violence against Black bodies. You refer to Ferguson, there's too many others to mention. I mean, there's so many specific key points. Of course, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor being the most prominent recently. But you've also worked on police reform, and this is a very contentious issue. I mean, both at Northwestern and in the world. I'm curious what your research, how have you shone a light on this and how you've approached this issue of what can be called abolish the police, defund the police, but also police reform?
Yeah. So, we've only worked on it through the center, through the lens of how Black Lives Matter messaging is landing on Black communities and also the broader community. And so what we found in our latest polling is that, again, the Democrats are wrong about what happened in the 2020 cycle. So if you take, for example, the commentary from a guy like Representative Tim Ryan in Ohio, very successful congressman. I hope that he's elected the next senator from Ohio to replace Rob Portman, or at least that's what I think is likely to happen. His analysis of the 2020 cycle is completely off. So what the Democrats say is that they lost seats in the 2020 cycle because some 3 or 4 members of Congress were tweeting about defund the police. And the Republicans ran ads against members of Congress, Democrats who are running in purple districts that said this person supports defund the police. It's a nice equation. They ran those ads. We didn't have a response. We lost seats. What actually happened is that the Republicans grew their vote share dramatically between the 2018 midterm and 2020 because Donald Trump's name was on the ticket. And so the Democrats actually overperformed in 2018 because it was a midterm. Trump lost seats. And then with Trump back on the ticket, we have a truer reflection of how evenly divided the congressional districts are. Now, what Tabitha Bonilla and I did was we asked people of all races, how do you feel about shifting money from police budgets to things like mental health services, homelessness assistance? How do you feel about changing the blanket liability waivers that police have? So when they shoot someone 7 times in the back or shoot a child who has a toy gun, they can be held civilly and criminally liable as individuals. What we found is that Democratic voters, regardless of their race, are highly supportive of those messages. We're going to do further follow-up studies. We even think that there's a way that moderates and conservative Democrats and perhaps moderate Republicans support these messages because police abuse cases
cost people tons of money, right? Like 35–40% of the budget of the Chicago goes to policing, right? And that's before you even get to the $12, $15, $20 million individual settlements for abuse cases. And so what we learned in 2020 is that the median white voter in the suburbs is not as racist as the Democrats assume they are. And, if you actually message in ways that they can understand, the defund the police message is one that sends them to the polls, right? And so because these videos, these viral videos that BLM movement have produced have affected everyone. And so where did Trump lose ground in 2020? He lost the suburbs in ways that he did not in 2016. So
it's been fascinating seeing the language around defund the police, abolish the police, police reform evolve.
Yeah,
I think people get stuck a lot on the rubric as opposed to the content of what's being suggested. And I think the way you described it is very productive. We have a question from Jan Half. I hope I'm pronouncing, or is it John? I don't know how to pronounce your name, but who says, who's a CESP 75 and
nice.
Worked in education. He's interested in what you have to say about presidential leadership and how we can educate young people about leadership and politics in general. And what are your suggestions for course offerings and activities at the K through 12 level? I don't know if you want to delve into that one, but it does feed into the question that I was planning on asking about. And I think these two things go together. What do you think about the new administration? How does it look from, Al Tillery of 2012, Al Tillery of 2017, and Al Tillery of 2021? There are probably different views of presidential leadership through Obama to Trump to now Biden. And maybe that can be a way of answering a question about, how do we educate people about leadership when we've had such whiplash the last few years?
No, it's tough being a presidential historian, particularly one of maybe 3 or 4 scholars of color that do this work, because I do a fair bit of leadership consulting and training on these issues. And, you'll go into these companies and someone will see, I was quoted as fact checking their favorite president. And you're like, they're automatically skeptical. Like, hey, you fact checked Donald Trump. I'm like, look back, I fact checked Obama too, right? Like that's part of the job. And so what I'll say is, and as someone who's met 3 presidents, what I'll say is that there is a kind of standard script for presidential leadership, and particularly when it comes to rhetoric, right? And so in the modern era, if we take the modern era to begin with FDR, all the way through to the end of the Obama era, most presidents communicated in very similar ways about the nation, about the rituals of the nation, about the transfer of power, which is at issue today, Mr. Trump's second impeachment trial. And what I found is that on race and gender and equality issues, the modern presidents, beginning with Truman, all the way up through to even people that we think of as hostile to the civil rights establishment, like Reagan, right, communicated unequivocally with a voice that the mission was to draw all of us together, right? So Reagan gets harangued consistently for stripping down the welfare state, just at a time when people of color needed it the most, right? He deserves to be harangued for that. He gets harangued for his welfare queen statement. He deserves to be harangued for that. But he apologized, right? He communicated in a way to say, okay, you know what? I was wrong about that. And so let me, go to Cabrini Green in Chicago and have Thanksgiving dinner with a family and try to learn, right? And so that has been the norm for presidential leadership. Even if you don't agree on policies to promote racial equity or parity or gender parity, you're supposed to use rhetoric that makes that our aspirational goal. Mr. Trump, by my research, is a singular outlier
in this regard. Now, we've had racist presidents before. The greatest civil rights president in history is caught using the N-word repeatedly on the tapes, right? And that would be Lyndon Johnson. Reagan and Nixon, when Reagan was governor of California and Nixon was president, are laughing and calling, the representatives to the United Nations from countries in Asia and in Africa, calling them monkeys, right? They're caught in '68 on tape. Everything was recorded in the White House at some point, right? And so, but they never spill that over into the public, right? Mr. Trump is singularly different in the sense that he made it an animating feature of his politics to win election. And that's disruptive. It's disruptive of the norms. And so I totally understand why he did it. It's why he won, to the strategic advantage that it gave to his party in that period. The question now going forward is, what does the next Republican president look like? Does he follow the Trump model, or does he follow the model of George H.W. Bush or George W. Bush, who in many ways was more progressive on race than even, say, Barack Obama was, right? So, and this is where the Obama people get mad at me. So George W. Bush wrote into law with Senator Kennedy that No Child Left Behind bill to close the racial gap in education, right? That's why it was done. He had the most diverse cabinet in American history, not Barack Obama, right? And so, the question of, what to assign, what I would say is we have very good presidential biography. We have very good interpretive, books on their records. But I would say go to the Presidency Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and you can read their papers and look at their clips directly. And you'll see that they all converge around this norm of our aspirational goal is equality. And that's something that I think is very important for all of us to remember in these fractured times.
Thank you. And I'll remind everyone, if you have questions, put it in the Q&A. We're coming to the end of the sort of my official questions, and I'd love to pick up some of yours if you give them to me. So finally, from my sort of questions, could you tell us a little bit, you've developed this fascinating new online course, which we've spoken a lot about, although I haven't taken it, I've looked at it. Can you explain to our alumni and friends who are here with us today how it's going, what it is, how it's going, and why you developed it? What's your goal with that?
Yeah, so, I think I developed it again as the center is supposed to be about translational research. So what the best knowledge from academia seeping out into governments, nonprofits, corporations to help them find ways to better live together under this rubric of multiracial, gender equitable, LGBTQ plus friendly, democracy. And so, I would get these calls to visit companies. Again, typically somebody's reading New York Times and they see I'm quoted, and they'll say, hey, can you come and speak to my company and talk about leadership or blah? And I would get there and they would say, now, thanks for the speech, but what do we do? What do we do when you leave? We've hired, a consulting firm and, we spend $100,000 with them and they pretty much told us what we already knew. How do we actually do this? And so I referenced my friend and mentor, Dick Neustadt, earlier in the conversation. All of the business school leadership, all the business school literature on leadership came initially from presidential scholars, people like James McGregor Burns and Dick, And so in the 80s and 90s, there was a shift to focus more on psychology, particularly the psychology of people who are resisting change. And the lesson being taught in business schools is don't go too far. You'll disrupt, what the powerful white men at the top of the organization want, and then you'll never get any change. And so I started visiting companies and I thought, this is precisely not what people should be learning. It's great to know about implicit bias. Okay, let's all take an implicit bias test. Go back to our cubbies. We all now know that we're somewhat racist, but not too racist. Now back to work, right? And so what I wanted to do with the course is provide an opportunity for people to learn best practices from inclusive leaders in history and courageous leaders in history, and learn ways to translate those to their businesses and their organizations. And so that's what the course is about. I've got to thank the advisory, some members of the advisory committee, Jill Hetherington and Brian Hetherington, Brian Posner, Paula Pretlow, having conversations with them, like, how do we do this, right? Like, is this a good idea? I remember being at a dinner with Jill Hetherington, and she leaned over and said, Al, like, it'd be great if you could kind of bottle this speech you just gave. And I said, okay, let's do it, right? And so far, so good. It's working. It's students are enrolling. They're thrilled about getting the certificate from Weinberg that carries your signature. And the feedback has been great. So great, we're doing a second course on racial equity that's going to launch sometime this spring. And for me, I want Northwestern, I want the center, the CSDD, to be the first place that people think when they want polling on diversity and democracy issues. I want them to think about the CSDD the way that they think about Pew for religion, or Kaiser for healthcare. The first place when they think about where can we get exec ed or training for leaders, I want them to think about us. And so that's the mission. And thank you for empowering me to to kind of start.
We are, we're delighted. I mean, I think this helps us. I think we're very interested in translational science. We're interested in translational social science, and we have a number of ways of doing it. And this is one great example. There's a few questions. I'm going to ask them in order. So Bob Shaw is asking, and it may be Bob and Charlene Shaw, I'm not sure. Sometimes they're together on the calls. Is the term defund, in terms of defund the police, causing more issues than the underlying concept? And I think we referred to that before. What do you think about the term defund?
Yeah, I don't think it is, actually. I think, slogans are a part of politics. Build back better. Stop the steal, right? And so, a hashtag that says, shift your local budgets from, spending 60% on policing to 20% on policing. That's not going to keep the millennials and the Gen Zers in the streets for 100 days as it did with, the summer. I think that it's up to all politicians to explain what their slogans mean in broader context. And my problem with the Democrats, as I've said to, DNC members and others, is that, if you don't provide the broader context, you allow your opponents to provide the broader context. And again, what happened in 2020 is that the seats that were lost because Mr. Trump grew his vote share by 7 million votes because he's on the ballot. Mr. Biden grew the vote share by 15 million votes. So it's still not enough, right? But that's why you lost those House seats. So now, as you figure out how do you provide information and context to defund, my advice to the Democrats would be to get aggressive, and to say, and have a couple frames. The good governance frame. It doesn't make sense when schools are closing to be spending this much on police, right? It doesn't make sense to have these payouts. That's how you've got to fill the void. But I don't think that the slogan by itself is a problem. The slogan of abolition might be a problem because there are just no models anywhere in the country of abolition working over the long haul. The only model that I know of is Camden, New Jersey, which is near where I grew up. They abolished, and then they immediately reconstituted a new community policing model. But, so that one I could see a little bit more as problematic than the defund hashtag.
So we got a lot of questions now suddenly. So I'm going to link two of them. Susan Boyd was asking about your research about the division in the country from the standpoint of population centers versus rural areas. And there's another question from Holly Leiker about what are the key initiatives we need to take to break the cycle of poverty and violence in the inner city? And I think those two are referring to the diversity of experiences based on where you are geographically in the country, and does that intersect with your research?
Yeah, sure.
Nationally?
Yeah, so we did this messaging experiment in Georgia, but we also did it nationally. And what we found nationally is that whites are not motivated to support the Democrats when you give them BLM messages nationally, but they're not demobilized. And that's really important for the Democrats to know, right? And so what that means is that there's opportunity in all 50 states. There are reform-minded voters in all 50 states that are concerned about, these criminal racial justice issues. And so that's the first thing I'll say. The rural-urban divide is a problem. It's a problem largely because what it means is that the folks that live in rural areas are overrepresented. These areas are overrepresented. They're net welfare receiving, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but what I mean is that Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., our tax dollars subsidize those places because they're places where there's not a ton of economic growth or development or investment from corporate America. And so, when you add up the senators from all of those places, they should have far fewer seats than they would have in a normal distribution, right? So they're overrepresented, and that makes our politics more conservative, right? And so, how do we fix inner city problems or problems of poverty? I think one way is to convince those people in those areas that they should be voting in ways that would expand opportunity for themselves and not defensively, not zero sum. And I think the COVID relief bill that Mr. Biden has put forward is a great opportunity here, right? I think you look at this remarkable Republican governor in West Virginia, Jim Justice, right? He's saying, plus up the COVID relief, right? And he's rolling out vaccines in ways that are really consistent with the Democratic priorities, right? And that's because West Virginia is the second or third whitest state in the nation, and it's overwhelmingly poor, right? It's got a very high poverty rate, net welfare receiving. And so partnering with people like him to get this COVID relief through and showing that good government works is an opportunity to grow people out of defensive voting about build a wall or guns or cultural things that ignore their pocketbook. And if you can do that, then the problems where most people live in the cities will take care of themselves. But it is also true that most people of color now live in suburbs, right? That are experiencing economic hardship. And so the cities have been gentrifying. And so that's another problem. So stopping gentrification might also help, with these issues as well. So it's very complex, but those are three things that I think could make a difference.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to combine two other questions. David Weinberg is asking about national service as a vector for ameliorating bigotry, et cetera, which I think has an historical sort of presence in our minds. And Phil Curley's asking, and I thought this might be a combination, have you compared your research about the US political leadership and race with other countries? Or look to see how other countries have addressed these? Have you done any comparative work? And I was just thinking about, the strength of national service in some places I'm familiar with certainly leads to a different way of people interacting at a certain moment in their lives.
Yeah. No, I think David's question, I'm a huge proponent of the national service idea. Charlie Rangel, when he was in Congress, a guy that was really kind to me when I was doing my dissertation research, he used to talk about both reinstituting the draft, but also reinstituting national service as a way to get people thinking about our common destiny, even if we didn't actually draft people or have a WPA, just having people signed up for it and getting volunteers into it would be a fantastic, opportunity to draw together. I totally agree with that. And David, I also say that what we see in public opinion with the millennial and Gen Z generations portends greater opportunity here. When we look across the country, regardless of the rural-urban divide, we see that young people are far more interested in living together, across racial divides, economic divides, and funding things for everybody. And frankly, that's what the insurrection was all about. The insurrection is about a bunch of baby boomer and Gen Xer politicians who grew up under the racial dictatorship, who see when you do the polling, and they have the same polls, only about a third of the country, we think about it as one, the two parties, the two parties don't have equal support. The Republicans have about a third of the support, has hardcore support. And when you go down in generations, it shrinks markedly. And that's why they want to hold power by any means necessary, because they know that, as they say themselves in gaffes, if everybody votes, we don't win. And that's incredibly dangerous. So what we're seeing is that attitudes have changed because, kids are going to integrated schools. Kids have the same common culture around TikTok, right? And all these other things. So if you can draw people into service projects together, it might be ameliorative as well, right? And then the second part of the question was
the comparative with other countries.
Yes. So America is uniquely situated, has a democracy predicated on, settler colonialism and slavery that has always proclaimed itself to be, a full democracy. And so when we look at similar countries like Brazil, we know that their struggles with authoritarianism and race have always been at the center. They're more ascendant because of Black consciousness movements, but we are exceptional in the sense that, we're not as progressive as some other countries like Australia or New Zealand, or if you think about the horrors of the Holocaust and how Germany moved very clearly to try to rectify the public record and have a statement about what that means for the nation. We've never really done that work of reconciliation and healing. South Africa has done it. And so we are exceptional in the sense that we've never done it. And so we're fighting over things like diversity training or the 1619 project versus, there's nothing in the 1619 project that our first years in history at Northwestern don't know. It's just in the New York Times, so a bunch of old people that grew up segregated in segregated spaces are learning these things for the first time. And so we're now going to have a big national fight about the 1619 project versus the 1776 project. Guess what? The first person to die in 1776 was also a Black guy, Crispus Attucks, right? So we shouldn't even be fighting about this, right? But we have these fights because the older generation is just catching up to the terms of the debate over the racial reckoning. And that's going to continue until the millennials and Gen Zers are the dominant voters in our country. And I think it will recede. I think these are the last gasps of dinosaurs. And so the problem is that a dying dinosaur is really dangerous, as we saw on January 6th.
Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh. It's just the idea of a dying dinosaur is an odd image, but it's very
yeah, sorry.
Al, thank you so much. There is more questions, but I can't get to them. It's really been great hearing about your research. We love the work the center is doing, and thank you for taking such a balanced approach to this very difficult subject.
Thank you, and folks are free to write to me on email. I will eventually respond, I promise.
So to all of you who tuned in today, I hope you found this valuable. We love spending 45 minutes with you, and hopefully it opened up a door to some new ways of thinking about this particular set of issues to do with leadership, race, etc. And thank you so much to all of you who support Weinberg College and Northwestern. It makes a big difference to us, your contributions, and just being here with us. So I hope you enjoyed today's talk. Thank you again, Al, Professor Tillery, and please join us again for future virtual conversations. Have a great day.
Thank you.